Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. This is the first, hopefully, of many joint LinkedIn live sessions between Intel and TIBCO. My name is Jesus Centeno. I'm the Office of the CTO at TIBCO, and I'm very happy to have everybody joining us today. Before we get started, just a quick housekeeping item and telling you a little bit about the format for the session itself. This session will be about like 30 minutes long. There'll be basically two segments in the session. I have 4 guest speakers, 2 from Intel side, 2 from TIBCO side. And, because it's only 30 minutes, we want to make sure that we answer all the questions that are coming in. So don't wait until the end. Feel free to post your question as soon as it comes to your mind, and we'll address the questions as they come along. So the topic for today, the power of open source in retail edge analytics. Very rich topic, plenty of things to talk about. So I'm just gonna jump straight into it. So for the first part, I'm welcoming Miguel Torres from TIBCO and Brad Corrion. And Brad comes from the Strategic Architecture Group at TIBCO, and Miguel comes from the Office of the CTO Group at sorry, I said Brad. Sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't tell, and then Miguel from TIBCO. Anyways, yeah. So let's get started. So Brad, we talk about this joint collaboration between the two companies. We talk about edge analytics, computer vision, but what is the exact problem that both companies are trying to address?
Well, thank you, Jesus. And so now you've outed me. I'm moonlighting for TIBCO. Right? So working for Intel and TIBCO, pulling down 2 paychecks, but no one has to know that except just the 5 of us here. I think really the problem is that the problem that we're addressing is how to make the edge, how to actually deploy use cases to the edge. Right, so there's an implicit theme here, which is that the edge is really important. And for retail, when we're talking about that in-store experience, as a great example, we need all sorts of sensors. We need to understand what's happening with product, what's happening with the customer, what's happening with employees, what's happening with consumables in the restrooms. I mean, everything about the environment. We really need to understand if we're going to provide the best experience we can for our guests. And when you start to inventory all of those capabilities that you need, the sensing, the devices, the things that connect to build up this environment, the analytics, the amount of information that has to move between systems or between computer architectures to the cloud, to other data centers. It's a tremendous amount of things to coordinate and to deliver in a repeatable fashion in a way that you can version control it and improve it and deploy a new experience, new capabilities, and do it again and again and again across hundreds or thousands of stores. And so the exciting part about the collaboration between TIBCO and Intel here is in a project. It's called Project Air, which is making this a repeatable, deployable process that power users, not necessarily deep technical experts, can then harness to collect the data, to set up the analytics, to set up the computer vision, and then just click deploy and have those workloads deployed out across all of those stores. So that's I think a big capability that's really going to make the edge adaptable and deployable. And that's what we're up here solving together.
Great. Yeah, great points right there. So we talk about like simplicity, scalability, like a repeatable process itself. So let me switch to Miguel here for a second. So why open source then, Miguel? I mean, what's really the case for open source here?
Yeah. So good question. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about open source, right? So I'm just trying to focus it on the experience that we've had in the great collaboration with Intel and TIBCO. So basically, and also narrow it down to the edge scope. So basically, we found that made it much easier to deploy and implement edge technologies, right? Mainly because it allows you for a fast pace of iteration in an ecosystem that is so complex that as the edge, where the stack is like really big, you would really want to iterate really fast, right? So when you have all this open source open to you that you can actually pick and try and investigate, it's much easier to actually plug and play and look into different technologies. And that's how Intel and TIBCO started collaborating, right? Like we saw this awesome VAS serving framework, and they saw Flogo and Project Air. So we started collaborating, and then we started to look at each other's software, and it started the path of iteration, right? And then you add these different other technologies. It also reduced the friction between internal and external departments. I mean, we're both like big enterprise softwares, and basically it just first sets the source of truth, and it's an easier way for you to interact without having all this proprietary friction, which is needed at some point, right? But it creates a different model that eases the collaboration. There is another interesting point that also drives standards and interoperability. Because you have access and visibility to all these different pieces of software, you can actually identify different patterns that overlap, and you can easily identify those, right? Like while before everything was a little bit more proprietary and a little bit less visible, those patterns were built separately, and everybody was trying to solve the same problem. So here you can focus on one or two different pieces of software that do the same thing. And the third point I wanted to make was more about this kind of like enabling partnerships with different vendors, right? Again, this visibility of being able to identify and learn about the different software for your different partners, it's just great, right? Because you can actually say, okay, well, you have these 2 or 3 different pieces of software that actually have a gap of mine, right? So you can easily identify that without having to go internally into all those departments. There's one other one that I think is super important, which is like open source brings a lot of, to me, innovation is about inspiration, right? And it's about like the more software you see, the more tools you see, it inspires you to create something more. Some people that are scared about open source software should think about this, right? It's like if your software is closed, nobody's gonna build on top of that. Nobody's gonna be inspired on like the different techniques that you're doing, and that's one thing that we've seen with Intel, right? Seeing the way they work, seeing the software all down to the code, it's inspired us to create different solutions, build on top of them, etc., etc. And the last one is this community building, right? We've seen how now that everything is open, it actually improves the way you can communicate and brings people in, right? Because people belong, that they're belonging to something useful.
So I think Miguel made some really great comments in there. You know, ending with the community building is fantastic, right? It's one place where you can find like-minded people who are trying to do the same kinds of innovations when you invest in open source communities. But I think one of the takeaways of investing in open source is that it lets you focus on the value-added contributions that your team can make while building off of the foundation that others have already done, right? So if you want to build this grand edge stack or build this new capability, you don't have to invent every piece along the way. You don't have to reinvent orchestration. You don't have to reinvent telemetry. You don't have to reinvent all of these foundational pieces just to get up to your little use case. And then you can move more quickly. Now, it may not be you. I said you don't have to invent, implying you are the software team doing this, but it could be your vendor, right? If you need to use your vendors to deliver these capabilities, and you're telling them we need this stack, if your vendors aren't using open source, then you're asking them to build up all these foundational capabilities as well. And so there's an acceleration to the innovation that says, if you guys do this, if we all agree to build this boring stuff together, then we can individually build our unique and valuable pieces on top, and we can still find our own markets, find our own customers while working together in this community.
Thank you for that. Yeah, great way of positioning open source and the value that it brings to the table. But I want to go back to one comment that you mentioned, right? So you said, you brought the term simplicity, right? But in the end, computer vision can get quite complex, right? And so, the abstraction needed, right, to abstract all that complexity is really part of that value added, right, that you're mentioning. But Can you go a little bit deeper on really what makes computer vision complex?
The concept of computer vision is a really deep well, right? And so we kind of have a situation where I want to watch a camera, right? I want to watch a video feed and react in real time so that a store associate can respond to a situation. Maybe it's a safety situation. Something has fallen across an aisle, and we want to be able to remove that barrier before someone has a trip and fall situation. And so it's quite simple. Well, I'll just go find a model and I'll deploy it, and I'll have this model watching the feed. And those simple few words of actually, hidden all sorts of details. One, how do you find a model? Right. Okay. Well, if you can't find a vendor who has a model, how do you train your own model? Now you have to collect the video, and you have to get a data science team, and you have to figure out how do you train to look for these? How do you have enough example pieces of evidence where the lighting conditions in this aisle the same as the lighting conditions in the aisles that the video was trained from, that the model was trained from? And so you have all sorts of challenges. But then even in just deployment, I said 1,000 stores. You have to get that model deployed to 1,000 stores. You have to find all the cameras. You have to have all those cameras feeding their streams to an engine that's listening to that model. And then you have a new version of that model, and you want to get it out there. These, are all small challenges. None of them are unsolvable, and a smart team can do all of them. But when you try to do all of them for one deployment and then try to scale that across 1,000 stores, it becomes untenable, and you need automation and abstraction to take away some of that challenge. And so that's what I think the collaboration here has really been focusing on, are those useful abstractions that don't complicate it, but actually simplify it for purposes of deployment at scale, so that when you have that model, here's a thing that you can do just to coordinate the deployment. Here's a thing you can do to find automatically the cameras that you need to find, and then create the pipelines between the cameras and the models, and then the models and the responses that go to the associates to take action when there's a dangerous situation in aisle 3. So that's the value of abstraction here, is that we're just trying to do the busy work that otherwise would swamp a team trying to do this all manually without automation and abstraction.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, I want to start tying into the retail use cases, but before we switch, really quickly, Miguel. So Brad, I think, mentioned Project AIR. So can you take a second to describe what Project AIR is and how it relates to the computer vision topic?
Yeah, and I'm going to build a little bit on Brad's great answer, right? So computer vision is really complex because it has all these different tiny little bits that you have to solve, right? So what we're trying to do with Intel, and that's Project AIR and VAS and some other computer vision capabilities that Intel provides, is to solve all those little pieces in a really good way, right? In the best way possible. So the Project AIR has different capabilities, right? Starting from the UI. So we have a very extensible UI written on Angular that allows you to have the dashboard visualization of basically where your devices are, and where you're going to deploy with those devices, and also allow you to deploy ML models inference at the edge, right? So those two are one of the main components for computer vision, right? But it's not the only thing. It's like, okay, you have now the ML models deployed, and you can see what your devices are, all the configuration, etc. So now you're going to have to throw some business logic on top, right? What are you going to do with that data? First of all, you need to pick up the data. So you have to define what's the source of your data going to be. And then you're going to say, okay, now I want to pass it through an ML model that, for instance, Intel's VAS solves. And then I'm going to do something with it, like store it on a database for analytics. I'm going to have a rule for receiving a notification. I'm going to get that frame and show it on the screen, etc. So there is this thing called data pipelining that we call. And in Project AIR allows you to do that in a no-code way, right? So you can actually drag and drop, and we are leveraging Project Logo, that is a TIBCO product, that actually allows you to do that in a very intuitive way and visualization way, right? So those are kind of like the main hardcore things, but we are adding more, right? Every single layer for Project AIR and Intel's VAS has extensibility. We're leveraging another open source framework called EdgeX that is sort of like the backbone of like what Edge computing normalization, the registration for devices provides you, right? And then we're building on top. We're creating these building blocks on top that all together solves the problem that Brad was talking about, right? All these little tiny little things that you have to put together to achieve computer vision at the edge, right? And then we throw a few other things on top. Obviously, we have the TIBCO cloud infrastructure that allows you to have analytics, etc. Like so we provide integration with that and other products, right? Like so you are not only constrained to TIBCO's technology. You can plug in all your databases, etc. So it's very extensible, very pluggable. And the last one, I would like to mention, like all these like sensor fusion and multi real-time streams of data analyzed together that we did together with Intel, that created that end-to-end experience for computer vision at a point of sale, where computer vision were analyzing with a camera that the things that you had bought, scanned, and weighted was correct, right? So we proved the point on the whole computer vision story at the edge for retail.
Excellent. And to learn more about Project Air, you can go to tibco.com/tibco-labs. Excellent. All right, so let's switch here to bring the retail point of view into this. So now I'm welcoming David Rosen from TIBCO and Kristen Cole from Intel. And
Thank
David,
you, Jesus.
Thank you. Yeah, and let me start with you, actually, David. So we talk about edge analytics, IoT, computer vision. Why is this so impactful in retail?
So let's step back, and I want to pick up on the conversations that both Brad and Miguel were talking about. And so now we'll bring it from essentially the tech stack into essentially both the retailer experience. This extends to nearly every industry. We'll talk about that later. And to the customer experience, right? Which is the strength of the product and technology combinations we've talked about. The solution itself is really based on a couple of things. Number one is multiple sources of data, right? One of which in almost every case is filmed data, live streamed data coming from a camera, computer vision, etc. Often combined with databases of product, databases of customer information, etc. And then in other cases, other streams, transactional data that is happening in real time. So what do we have? We've got multiple streams of real-time data. That data is becoming increasingly complex in terms of the nature of it. Obviously, computer vision data being of an entirely different level of size complexity than transactional data, not to minimize transactional data. And as Brad, I think, pointed out, or possibly Miguel, the idea that essentially says, now, how do I essentially take these multiple concurrent streams that are happening across, in a retail world, across 1,000 doors, across an entire country, continent, whatever it might be, and make smart, fast decisions with that information? What are the business rules that essentially say, if the following things are happening in correlation, what is the business rule of what happens next, right? So as we kind of mentioned, if I am at checkout doing a transaction, let's say I'm in self-checkout, what are the implications for essentially if I am missing a transaction or in worst case scenarios, trying to defraud the system? As Brad pointed out, what if there is, an accident on aisle 3, but more realistically, if I'm having a stocking issue where I'm actually losing sales and I'm able to capture that? What if I'm essentially tracking inventory that is through a pipeline and a supply chain, et cetera? How do I essentially take the information that I'm gleaning and in real time create the next action to essentially rectify that situation and do so in a scalable way? And do so in a way that doesn't require a computer technician at every single one of my locations across the board, but make sure from an edge standpoint, these things are happening in real time, because these are all real-time decisioning that has to happen. And so kind of passing the ball on to Kristen, these are use cases that we've worked on together collectively as a team. But let's talk about some of the areas to which kind of, again, that kind of multi-stream consolidation of data and business rules can really apply to retail, and what are some of the cases that we may be seeing in the stores in which we shop over the next couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, David, and great conversation so far. You guys have hit on so many great topics. Excited for the collaboration. As you mentioned, loss prevention is a big one, right? And loss prevention can happen either at the checkout or throughout the store. And having our collaboration together, making the architecture so it can be deployed quickly has been a exciting time to watch this happen. So along with loss prevention, we've also seen, inventory optimization, like you mentioned, David, right? What's happening in my store? What's on my shelf? If I'm going to do a BOPUS, how can I ensure that the customer is actually getting the product that they requested? Or can I actually see what's on my shelf to recommend a different product? So some of those are very important. So that's really, having that customer experience bucket that I like to call it. And then we have the associate, empowering the associate. What kind of use cases can I help the associate with? Is there a shipment that needs to be put away? It can't automatically check itself in. What can I do to empower the employee with, there's a customer that's standing on aisle 5, they're like very confused. Can I send a customer over there or an associate over there to help my customer? So there's a lot of different ways to help the associate. And then on the other bucket that I like is operational optimization, right? How can I have efficiency in my operations to help, build onto the use cases of associate and the consumer. So you guys have hit on a ton. I don't know if I can expand on any of those, but in the retail space, and it can cover, in retail, there is, a lot of subcategories. There's grocery, there's C-store, there's pharmacy, there's a ton of different retail in there, and they all have unique problems, right? I want to know who my favorite customer is walking in the store, but I also want to know what they're buying, and I want to make sure that it's there for that C-store, speed of service. Maybe they're coming into a Starbucks. It's not necessarily speed of service, but do they have their favorite chair waiting for them or something, right? So it's really getting creative, and I love the way that you put it, Miguel, of the open source community can think of what's art of the possible together, because it's not always obvious what you can do with all these sensors, right? And if you have a community thinking about this, it can be pulled together in ways that you never thought of. When you guys took off the sensor fusion architect that Intel did, and you guys put that together, you did it fast, you did it and did it in a way that we never thought that we could do it, because you brought in your goodness, you brought in your expertise and your creativity. So that's just shows how putting collaborative ideas can make things happen in a different way.
Yeah, just adding to that, I think is when you were going through those use cases, you pointed out 3 areas of choices, right? And essentially when we've got a lot of different choices, we have kind of infinite possibilities. And just kind of going back to what you were saying is you said that there are many, many different sources of information. It might be customer preferences in a CRM database or a loyalty database. So we actually know what customers' preferences might be. We also might know what her past purchases are. That becomes a data stream that essentially allows us to, and I'll get to that in a moment. We have information that essentially resides in product databases, right? From the standpoint, what are the product attributes? How do they align to each other? What is their correlation in terms of what should be sold? We have information that is coming from direct transactional feeds, right? So what is essentially being purchased at any given time? What are traffic counts? What do we have from the standpoint of ingress and egress? How are we capturing in the role of a drive-through customer identification, whether it's through license plate scanning or through another RFID or other sensor scan? And then what's also very interesting is we've got so many different next actions, right? We can recommend a next product to buy. We can, from an operational standpoint, put more burgers on the grill. We can start that latte. We can create an alert to a store security guard, to your point earlier about shrink, in terms of essentially allowing very subtly someone to be spoken to or addressed if we feel that there is a risk of substituting a $100 bottle of wine for a less expensive bottle of wine, because they kind of look the same and weigh the same if we're all familiar with self-checkout. So that combination of input sources of data, means with which we capture data, sensors, scanners, cameras, etc., and logical next actions really then speaks back to what Miguel was talking about, which is ultimately great entrepreneurs, great innovators, great collaborators are going to be the ones that determine the use cases. We can put them down all we want in terms of PowerPoint slides, but ultimately the success of this is going to come from the community.
Well, and I want to say, and I actually want to just add one more thing, that the work that we've done is come off the PowerPoint and actually gone into real life. And so that's some of the exciting pieces.
No, but yeah, speaking of innovative use cases, a question coming in here in terms of what is that you guys are seeing with the overlap of IoT, ML, edge analytics, even things like augmented reality, for example, right? And how that overlap is really shaping up a brand new set of use cases. Any comments on that?
I think.
Well,
Go ahead, Brad.
There's so much. I mean, augmented reality isn't fun unless you can tell what's in the scene, right? So you need the analytics to be able to understand what the viewer is looking at through augmented reality to create the immersive experience, right? So much of this experience keeps coming back to understanding what's around in those multi-streams of data that David so clearly explained. We have all this information. We're constantly trying to process it to deliver these new experiences. I think what's interesting, though, is you listed off a couple of technologies there, a couple of capabilities, augmented reality and more. The truth is, this is just going to get faster and faster, right? Once we succeed with one of these technologies, we build a great customer experience. We built the best loss prevention, whatever it is. When that success resonates, the teams will come with more requirements. Even the simplest project will grow in requirements. I didn't know you could do that. Can you also tell me the quantity of the items on the scale? Right. So the things will keep adding and adding and adding. And if your team isn't prepared for that growth of requirements, growth of use cases, that accretion of technology needs, it's going to be a challenging slog for those business teams. And so that's where working in these open source projects, investing in these communities, investing in automation, and getting an experience, I think, can be a tremendous strategy to preparing for this eventual growth and requirements and use cases for the business teams.
Excellent. All right. So believe it or not, we're almost at time here. I know time flies, right? And we definitely we need a part to this conversation. But let me close by sharing my screen and give a pointer to folks that want to figure out the best way to get it started. And so hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yep. So we have a joint website, and the URL is right there on the screen. It's pretty easy to remember. So tibco.com/resources/computer vision/Intel. That's the easiest way to learn a little bit more about what has been done under the collaboration. There is a nice video that explains and goes deeper into some of the use cases that Kristen mentioned in retail. And there's also a solution overview that you can download from there. But if you have any questions, or if you're ready to get the conversation started, if you want to have a specific one-on-one with one or more of the panelists today, feel free to send us an email at tibcolabs@tibco.com, and we can certainly make it happen. So with that, I just want to thank all the panelists today, everybody that attended for your time, and we certainly hope to see you again very soon. Thanks again for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.